And we are live with Dr. Patrick Wolf, the distinguished professor and school choice aficionado, master Jedi, teacher, Skywalker guy from the University of Arkansas. Has the one lightsaber that we all need when it comes to fighting for school choice, which is basically facts and rational thinking. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on this morning. I appreciate it, man.
Happy to be with you, Chris.
Well, listen, I want to tee it up a little bit because this is a great week. For people who fight for school choice all the time, we have these petty battles back and forth with individuals at the grassroots level, and then on Twitter, and then in local school boards, and then with states. But a couple of days ago, and I just asked you about what I'm about to say, there was a Supreme Court ruling that to me is on par with Brown versus Board of Education. That's going to sound very dramatic to folks, but I'm going to try and prove it throughout this show, and we'll see at the end if I made the case or not. But the case was Espinosa versus the Montana State Department, or Department of Revenue. And in this case, there was a plaintiff, a parent, whose name was Kathy Espinosa. She was a single mom who had kids that were being bullied in school and not thriving in public school. One of the reasons they were being bullied was because of their Christian faith. And she found a Christian school that was a good fit where the kids could thrive. She had garage sales, bake sales. She sold things. She took on a second job as a janitor. She did everything she possibly could to do what most parents would do, is work really hard to get their kids into the best possible situation that they could get them into. And lo and behold, comes a program in the state of Montana that allows citizens to get a tax break for money that they donate to charitable organizations that provide scholarships to family like Kendra's. So let's just make sure that we're clear about how money works in this situation. I voluntarily, as a taxpayer, give money to a charitable organization who I appreciate the work that they do, and they take that money and give it to people like Kendra. And because it's supporting the public good and education for Kendra's children, I get a tax break for the money that I use to support families like hers. That's the way the money works. It's all of a voluntary situation. It all involves the public good, my personal charity, my ability as a family to support other families and be a good American. Great. Then comes along the Department of Revenue, who says you can't be part of the tax credit program if you are a religious school, you're a religious institution. And the Supreme Court backs them up on that. So they kick families like Kendra out of the program. But the Montana Supreme Court goes even further. It not just kicks out religious schools, it kills the whole program. It says it's just unconstitutional for me as a private citizen to get a tax break for supporting families like Kendra's. Okay, so that's where we're at. Makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And a day before yesterday, 2 days ago, the Supreme Court rules in favor of families and freedom and justice and American people and values, good values, and Superman, Batman, all the good stuff, right? And basically says you cannot allow a state to discriminate on the basis of religion. Just because religious adjacent schools can participate in this program doesn't mean that it's the same as the state establishing religion. That is a watershed moment in terms of school choice policy, because nationally, for years and years and years and years, these programs have always been attacked underneath the idea of separation of church and state, and something that we'll delve into a little bit more around the Blaine amendments, which is really the genesis. It's really the beginning point, the water spring, the wellhead of anti-school choice sentiment. It all goes back to there. And that is a very racist, nativist, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, atheist over religious people. And by the way, correct me, Pat, when anything that I say today, correct me on it. But I do believe it's like 78% of Americans consider themselves to be either Christian or religious in one way, shape, or form, right? So it's the majority of Americans. This is part of our culture. So anyways, that's my setup. We've just witnessed in our lifetime the equivalent of Brown versus Board in my mind. So now, Patrick, fight me on it.
Well, let me just start by kind of laying out the argument that Justice Roberts made in his majority opinion. It was a 5-4 opinion, so it was a near thing. Brown v. Board was 7-2, so it was a more conclusive vote for the court. This was a near thing, and so, as you mentioned correctly, Montana is one of the 38 states that has one of these hateful Blaine amendments. And the Montana amendment says that no public funds can go directly or indirectly to a organization that is sectarian or owned or operated by a church, by a religious organization. And the indirectly part is really important in this case because, as you explained, it's a tax credit scholarship program. I mean, the government never handles the money. It just gives individuals a tax break for the donations they're making to further this public cause of the education of children in private schools of choice. So it's the indirectly part that you could argue that money. Resources are going indirectly to sectarian schools through this program. And so the Montana Department of Revenue says, well, we got a Blaine amendment. We can't allow the money to go indirectly to religious schools. So we're gonna ban religious schools from the program. And Ms. Espinoza and 2 other families said, no, we want to send our kids to religious schools. And so they sued. It went to the Montana Supreme Court, and the Montana Supreme Court said, oh boy, we have a free exercise problem. We can't discriminate directly against people because of their religion. So we're gonna outlaw the whole program for everybody. It's sort of like when one of your kids does something wrong and you can't figure out which one did it, and you say, okay, I'm going to punish both of you.
Everybody. I just want to be very clear with you. Politics aside and court cases aside, it's a very effective method.
Okay, all right.
As a parent of multiples, very effective. Who broke this? I don't know. Wasn't me. Okay, everybody loses their Xbox. He did it. It worked, just so you know. Anyways, but keep going.
Okay, yeah. So it was challenged that the mothers challenged that ruling, and it went to the Supreme Court. And so what Justice Roberts argued is he argued this. He said the original rule clearly discriminated against people based solely on the fact that they were religious, against people and organizations based on the fact that they were religious. That requires that's okay under our Constitution, but it requires what they call strict scrutiny by the judiciary. Basically, you have to have a good reason. And the way it rules, strict scrutiny is defined as, to satisfy it, government action must advance interests of the highest order and must be narrowly tailored in pursuit of those interests. So it's a very high bar. You have to have a great reason, Montana State Supreme Court, for invalidating this program. And Justice Roberts said, well, the best reason people can come up with is to protect the public school system from competition. And that's not good enough.
Wow, really?
So that's essentially Roberts' ruling. Was because this whole thing, and then he also says the fact that you took it away from everybody still doesn't stop the fact that you're harming the free exercise of religion, right? Because the religiously oriented people are being denied the benefit either way. Either they're the only ones being denied it, or everybody's being denied it. Either way, they're being denied it. It's a free exercise infringement. There's not a good enough reason for it. So that's the Roberts reasoning on this.
And why is Roberts pivotal? I thought I saw something from Gorsuch that was pretty important to me. I'll think about it as it comes to me in his position. But why is Roberts pivotal?
Well, Roberts has become the swing vote on the court. He sometimes sides with the more liberal 4 members and forges a 5-4 majority that way, he somewhat more frequently sides with the 4 conservatives, as he did here, and forges a 5-4 majority. So when he's the swing vote, basically his opinion and his argument is determinative. It decides what the ruling's going to be. And so he wrote the majority opinion here, but all of the other 3 out of the 4 other conservative judges wrote concurring opinions, basically saying we agree with the decision, but for different reasons. And as you mentioned, Gorsuch's opinion is very interesting and a lot more impactful, but it's not the majority opinion, so it doesn't really sort of count as controlling. But he argued, that Roberts was incorrect to say that the violation was that people were treated differently because of who they are. They were religious people. They were religious institutions, and not because of what they would do. They would do religious things. And he said, the whole idea of free exercise is people can do religious things, and that's when religion is meaningful. And so he basically argued the decision is correct. This is impermissible, unconstitutional, but it's because we can't prevent Americans from doing religious things. That's what the free exercise of religion right is all about. So the Gorsuch ruling, I think, resonates a lot more with religious people.
Does this do anything to change the nature of what we consider to be separation of church and state? Does this, how's this play into that?
Sure. Well, of course, I have to chuckle a little bit because separation of church and state doesn't appear anywhere in the U.S. Constitution. Most people think it does, but
I've heard that before. So why is it such a thing then? It appears somewhere. It's like in our bones somehow.
Well, yeah, it's from the writings of Thomas Jefferson. I believe Notes on the State of Virginia, or no?
Oh my God, is it in that racist?
No, it's not in that. It's in a
say.
separate writing he had. It's got a really long title.
Yeah.
Remonstrance against. He was objecting to the state of Virginia taxing people specifically to pay the salaries of clergy. So basically, clergy would be supported not from the collection basket, but from a state tax. So it's something like the remonstrance against the religious tax in Virginia was his writing, that where he described a separation of church and state. But that's, and Justice Thomas makes this argument in his concurring opinion here in Espinoza, that the Establishment Clause was never intended to construct this strict wall between government and religion and prevent government from promoting religion. He, as an originalist, Thomas argues, no, the founders wanted government to promote religion. They just didn't want to restrict it, and they didn't want government to choose a single religion that enforce people to all be Anglicans or all be Catholics or anything like that.
I think people get that part really wrong, is that it's not none of these programs are establishing a single entitlement for a religion. I mean, for one religion, Islamic, Jewish, non-religious people, the Church of Eckankar, Scientology, whatever you want in terms of all religions can play at this table. So in that way, it's not the state establishing one religion.
Right. I mean, if anything, you could argue that the closest the state comes in establishing one religion is the public school system, with a particular kind of ideology and admitting of no rivals, and that a school choice program that allows people to choose from among secular and religious schools, and within religious schools choosing all kinds of different religious schools, like you described, that's fully consistent with the religious principles of the Constitution. Nothing's being established, and it's encouraging a free exercise.
That still might not appease people who really do feel that any religion anywhere in government that's attached to tax dollars is somehow a step too far. And I imagine we're going to hear more about that.
Right. And this really underscores the divide between the originalists on the court and the people who believe that it's a living document and you update your understanding of the Constitution based on prevailing norms. And a lot of them say, hey, we're a much more secular society now than we were at the founding. And so we have to protect people who aren't religious. And then the originalists say, no, the Constitution, this is a Constitution for a country that believed in religious freedom, including, freedom to be religious, not just freedom from religion. And so you get these kind of conflicts, in extreme cases like prayer before or after a sporting event initiated by, can a public school teacher participate in it? Maybe not. Maybe that's sending too strong of a signal to to students that religion is good and a more favorable view of it. Can a public school teacher lead it? That the courts ruled no, they can't. Mm-hmm. That's too much of an endorsement of religion. But in this case, it's more about can families choose a school where there will be religious instruction that they support and that's consistent with their values, and can they use resources of the state to do that? And the court ruled yes. And as you suggested, it's potentially a monumental decision.
So do you have an issue if there is? So you mentioned that one of the concerns was not having pastors, preachers, folks who lead churches being publicly paid. So like public funding is actually funding a pastor in a pulpit is something that founders and others probably didn't want to see. Someone in one of these cases that I read made a similar argument that if we didn't want it for pastors, how could we want it for teachers to do the exact same thing that we don't want to pay pastors to do out of the public purse? Let's ask kind of a provocative question. I'm okay with everything we're talking about right now, but, don't you think that some of the people that would agree with me on this would have a problem with an Islamic teacher being paid to teach students Islamic history, politics, religion, strategy, with public tax dollars?
So it is, you're on one side of this issue or you're on the other is kind of how it shakes down. And, but I think you're right to point at, this is a potential tension in the court's jurisprudence, because they recently ruled in a case called HosannaTabor that, there was a Lutheran, teacher, a woman who's a teacher at a Lutheran school, and she was fired, and she argued she was fired because of a disability, not because of her performance in the classroom. And so she said federal labor laws prohibit the Lutheran school from firing her. And the Lutheran school argued, well, she's a minister, because everyone who teaches in our school is a minister of the Lutheran faith. And so freedom of religion means federal employment law doesn't control our employment decisions. And the court actually ruled in favor of the Lutheran school. And said, as you suggest, there is religious instruction. Religious instruction is part of her job. Therefore, the religious organization decides if she's doing it well or not. And these labor laws, federal labor laws, don't apply to them. So there is that tension between the HosannaTabor ruling. Teachers are clergy in a sense, or play a clerical role in religious schools, and the Espinoza decision, which says that this is education and not sort of religious instruction per se.
So a lot of this is on the side of what we think about teachers, the separation of church and state, and all those things. That's great for conversation. But at the end of the day, I think the real star of the story is the parent who has a child who needs to be educated. And I just wonder if you can help me understand the broad argument that people make about the public good, that the state has a compelling interest for every child to become educated. This is how we get our informed citizens. This is how informed citizens become the people who are qualified for a government that governs based on consent of the governed, right? So that, as a principle of liberals and progressives, that there's a compelling interest for public education to take place, but somehow it breaks down when you get to Kendra's family. I mean, is there a compelling interest not just to be educated, but to be educated for her daughters to be put into a place where they can thrive and where every part of their being, including their religion, their faith, is affirmed as part of their development process? Is there a case to be made that that is for the public good also?
I think there is a strong case to be made, and this is in opposition to Justice Breyer's dissent. He's following up on arguments he made in the Zellman v. Simmons-Harris federal. That was the case that determined that a school choice program, a private school choice program, was constitutional under the federal government. This was a question about whether it was constitutional under Montana state government. But Breyer has made a consistent argument against private school choice, basically saying that it endangers the citizenship preparation and citizenship values of our country, and it threatens an unraveling of our social fabric, that it will be divisive, and that you pretty much need government-run public schools to train children to be effective democratic citizens. That's kind of that's really Breyer's argument. And what's interesting is how divorced that argument is from the actual facts. So I've done quite a bit of research in this area. Other notable scholars have as well. And it's a very persistent finding that private schools of choice are more effective than government-run public schools in promoting the civic values of their charges. That students who experience private schooling tend to be more tolerant of others and other opinions. They tend to be more politically knowledgeable, more politically active. They tend to volunteer more in their community. I mean, these are all the things that we want democratic citizens to be doing. And private schools of choice encourage them to do them at higher levels even than the government-run public schools that Justice Breyer holds out as necessary for our representative to democracy to thrive.
So you just mentioned that there's research that says that there are some benefits to private school participation, and you named a couple there. There's this other body of work that I've seen you and Corey DeAngelis talk about, which is, things like, civic participation, less likely to be on drugs, on government programs, less likely to get pregnant, more likely to be in a safe environment. There's just like this number of things that are seen as benefits of private schooling. But how strong is that research? If I had a different PhD on this discussion right now, we were sitting here talking about this, the first thing they would want to do is attack how strong the research is. How strong is that body of research?
Sure. Let me distinguish between the research on civic outcomes and the research on these other non-cognitive outcomes that you mentioned that are really important, like criminal behavior and out of wedlock births and stuff. So on the civic side, the evidence is quite strong. There are a total of 86 statistical findings about the association between exposure to private schooling and your civic values and civic outcomes. And 50 of those 86 are clear findings of a private school advantage. 33 of them are findings of no difference, which really is kind of a win for private schooling, right? I mean, if private schools do as well as government-run schools in promoting public values, then we shouldn't steer people away from them. And then only 3 of the 86 are findings that government-run public schools produce better civic outcomes. Now, some of these studies use very rigorous methods to control for the type of people who choose private schools. So if we just limit the findings, our focus to the findings from those very rigorous statistical studies, then it's still, I think, a majority of those findings still show a private school advantage. It's not quite as overwhelming, but it's still stronger results than on the public school side, even from the most rigorous studies. Now, in terms of the other body of research on things like crime, effects on crime, and pregnancy and things like that, we are just at the very beginning of studying those questions. It's much more difficult data to get access to because it's considered very sensitive. So, but where we've been where we and others have been able to get access to the data, we generally do find that private schooling, I think for the reason you gave, because it reinforces the values being taught at home. So the student is not getting mixed messages about values. They're getting a consistent set of messages from their parents and from their educators about how they should behave, what morals they should hold, what ethical practices they should engage in. Because of that, we're seeing evidence that's highly suggestive that private schooling and private school choice promotes, better character traits and better behaviors that will contribute to people having a better life.
Is that somehow, though, attributable to the fact that it's a selective population?
That's always a challenge in this kind of research. And the study that Corey DeAngelis and I did of the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, we very carefully matched these the students in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program with very similar students in Milwaukee public schools on a variety of important background factors, including the neighborhood they lived in. And as we know, people tend to live in neighborhoods with other people who share their values. That's a very, sociologists have established this definitively, that we tend to live in neighborhoods with people who share our values. And so you've got these two groups who have similar values. The parents of one group choose public schools for their kids. The parents of the other group choose private schools. And then 15 years later, when you look at crime statistics, you see lower crime rates for the ones who chose private schools, controlling for a bunch of other factors. So it's not quite, random assignment gold standard. I like to do those kinds of studies when you can. We couldn't do it in this case. But it's very strong silver standard. It's rigorous research.
Silver standard. You've just given me a new kind of like, most of your critics are silver, bronze, or aluminum standard.
A lot of them are aluminum standard.
Yeah, aluminum standard.
Yeah, and the two studies Corey and I have done on this have both been published in peer-reviewed journal articles. One was published in Social Science Quarterly last year, and then the follow-up study that includes the evidence on out-of-wedlock births that has been accepted and is forthcoming in the Journal of Free Enterprise. That's going to be coming out later this year.
It seems like it would be great to have the ability to look at twins of the same family, one who went to religious private school and one where the mom put the kid in a charter school or district school, mom or dad, to be able to say definitively, no, this really is same family, same students, same DNA by far, more than others. And let's look at the outcomes and see if they're different. There has also been some research around, which honestly, what I'm about to say, I know never will make it into the debate, but there definitely some research around, for instance, Black students that attend church once per week and the statistical difference in their life outcomes that happen from that one time a week, and then when they attend twice. So for many Black families, church on Wednesday and church on Sunday is a thing. And same population, same neighborhood, same zip code, same street. If you go once per week, it changes your life outcomes. If you do the double dip, which I was actually part of for a period of my life, then the outcomes greatly change. And you have to ask yourself, we're always arguing in education and ed reform about what works and what would make the situation better and what changes the trajectory of children, but we can't touch this one. There's this really kind of anti-God, anti-religious, Jesus is bad type of situation that is preventing us from just getting over ourselves and doing what's best for kids in some cases.
I think you're exactly right, Chris. And the folks who study the effect of religion on educational outcomes, I'm thinking of like David Sickink at the University of Notre Dame. I mean, school choice people like me, we do it indirectly because we study choice programs, and most parents want. If they're sending their kid to a private school, most parents want to send them to a religious school, even when they have secular schooling options. And it's not always the specific religion that they hold at home. Generally under the general umbrella of Christianity, a lot of Catholics and Protestants, will want to send their child to a school that's broadly Christian in terms of its value orientation and attention to the Bible and things like that. Whereas they're going to be teaching the kids other things too. I mean, there's this like stereotypical view that any Christian school is going to be anti-evolution in its science curriculum, is going to neglect math and English and focus almost exclusively on religion and religious doctrine. Well, we know that's really not the case. And even if it were the case, a school was like that, a Christian school was like that, very few parents would choose that because they want their child to be effectively educated, and they want their child to have these moral values that come from religion. And I think the bottom line is we don't see any evidence that that secular ethics programs and ethics curriculum can substitute for the sort of profundity of religious instruction, where basically the child reaches a point where they feel they're accountable to God, to a power greater than and outside of themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's a much more powerful shaper of their subsequent behavior than some curriculum that says, we should all be nice to each other. Yes, we should all be nice to each other, but who's going to hold that person accountable when nobody's looking? Well, God can play that role if you're a believer.
I mean, without God, the marshmallow test becomes a lot harder. I just want to note for folks, like if you look at Patrick Wolf's hat here, it says Stuart Wolf. We are currently running for president and vice president of the United States on a platform of liberty and freedom for all, including children and including children that need an education. And I just would say, somewhat ironically, all of this that I'm saying right now, people take with a grain of salt. But without Jesus, there would probably be a high probability that you and I would not be having this conversation right now. We would not be sitting in the same place. I wouldn't find a need to find common ground with people across all different kinds of cultural, racial backgrounds or whatnot if I didn't believe that my God commands me to see the unsurpassable worth of every person, even when we disagree or whatnot. I wouldn't be sitting at this table right now. We wouldn't be having this conversation. And so thank you, Jesus, for creating relationships that didn't exist before. This isn't me trying to convert anybody into anything else. It's just to say that I'm an imperfect person, and my imperfection would probably lead me to stick to people that don't cause me any frustration of thought. People who allow me just to be, to not have to think about these type of things, which can be a pain in the butt sometimes. So I can see personally, even though school didn't do it all for me, definitely secular institutions didn't make me a person that wanted to be broad-minded and see the humanity in every other person, even when they really just get on my nerves. You know, it's actually religion that did that, and more than religion, it's faith in something bigger than myself that made me a person that at least will struggle with it. And I do think we put too much value in secular institutions because we think they're safe and common and universal, and that they'll accept all of us and that we can do everything. But they're not making us, I think or struggle in any meaningful way with higher order thinking and more universal kind of things about the brotherhood of man and woman, woman and man, and however you want to do. Lord, don't let me go down that pathway, and all of that. So I actually looked up the professor that you just were talking about. I think people should go check it out. David Sikkink, and it's Sikkink is his last name. He's at the department. He's in the Department of Sociology at Notre Dame. And I think it's pretty interesting to interject. If we want to talk about the common good, there is a reason to have a conversation about what religion and faith contributes to the common good and to society beyond just schooling. I think it would help us with this discussion more to get out of the kind of knee-jerk secular rights thing that keeps us locked up in all of this. To go a different direction just a little bit, do you worry, though? School choice is often making the argument around the rights of the individual, the rights of the family, as I do, and I think are very important. But do you give any credence to the pushback on what this does to the majority system? The majority of children in the United States are in district public schools. There are 17 or 14 to 16,000 school districts in the United States. I think 90 to 100,000 schools that are public schools run underneath a district of some sort. District, state, right? That's the structure. Do you worry at all by things like this that we're talking about right now, opening up the doors for more people to disinvest in what the majority are benefiting from and it hurting the majority of kids?
Sure, that's a strong argument that is made against private school choice, that the kids left behind in traditional public schools will suffer as a result. Just like the situation with, the claim that private schools undermine civic values, there's a substantial amount of evidence that claim is incorrect. That are the principles of competition that are really central to many aspects of our society actually hold in the case of education as well, and that basically there have been 29 statistical studies of what happens to kids in traditional public schools when private school choice programs are launched or expanded. And in 28 of those 29 studies, they find at least some evidence that student test scores go up when traditional public schools face competition from school choice. There's only one out of those 29 studies, and it's from a former grad student of mine. So there's no bias in this stuff, where he and his co-author found no effects in a study of the Florida program. But in the 28 other studies all across the nation, from Vermont to Milwaukee to Arizona to Texas, these studies have found that when faced with competition from school choice, traditional public schools step up their game. Mm-hmm. And some of the studies even sort of went inside the black box to examine, well, what are public schools doing differently when they face competition compared to when they don't face competition. When they face competition, they communicate more frequently and more effectively with parents, which makes sense because all of a sudden parents are now customers who might leave, as opposed to captive of that school district. So they communicate more frequently and effectively with parents. They initiate new programs that they think will be attractive to parents and students, and they fire the least effective teachers. Those are three really good things for traditional public schools to do, and they do them more frequently when they face competition from school choice, and that creates a rising tide that lifts all boats.
I don't know if I believe that, but the difference between what I believe and what you believe is that you believe in evidence, and I try to believe in evidence. Sometimes my gut takes over, though, and this is what, like in this case, this is what strikes me as really problematic, which is I get the sensitivity if I'm in a traditional school system where I feel like my hand is tied behind my back in so many ways. Like I just heard you say firing teachers, and that throws an alarm up to me right now of like, if I run a private school or a charter school, the ability of me to craft my staff to the needs of the students on a regular basis, year by year, and keep pruning it so that it gets better and better is a way easier process than if I'm in a district with a superintendent, multiple bargaining units, teachers that collectively, like the idea that the mediocre teacher is the most powerful person in American public education only comes from the fact that it's not because of private schools, private school choice, or charter schools. It becomes because of the bureaucratized, unionized, standardized, industrialized school system that makes it harder to do what private schools can do. So if you come talking to me about, let's have a competition, we're going to have a basketball tournament. I'm going to make all of your players wear ankle weights and wrist weights, and I'm going to put some of them steel collars around their neck like they used to make slaves wear. And then my team is going to be free to wear whatever shoes they want, whatever outfits they want, whatever they want to do or whatnot. Now let's have a competition. I'm joking, but it feels a little bit like the, telling a principal in an urban school district, let's compete, when they know that their teachers can just say no to stuff sometimes and just not do it. Whereas a private school principal can say, okay, well, you don't have to do it and you don't have to go home, but you got to get the hell out of here. Right.
Right. So, yeah, private schools do have much more autonomy than traditional public schools have, and much more the ability, as you suggest, for their leaders to sort of forge a common culture and a common sense of purpose among the staff. And they do that, basically because of greater flexibility in terms of hiring and firing of teachers. And also because, I think there's more of a sense that teachers teach in a particular private school because they want to, because they really buy into and believe in what that distinctive school is trying to do. And that's a sharp contrast with the traditional public school system. Traditional public schools are not supposed to be distinctive. They're supposed to be uniformly vanilla. In fact, I mean, there was a famous school choice case in Florida, Bush v. Holmes, in 2006, where the original Florida school choice program was struck down by the Florida State Supreme Court because it doesn't guarantee a uniform public education. Mm-hmm. That every K-12 student receive exactly the same education. Well, you're a parent of multiple students. Should your children all receive exactly the same education? No.
Well, I mean, this is a very important point, though, Patrick, because that word uniform is in many state constitutions, and it's a problem. I mean, some say adequate, but the ones that say uniform, my state says uniform. And it becomes a real problem for trying anything new or different, because you can make an argument that any school outside of the district system that doesn't deliver the same tests, the same curricula, the same everything is not part of a uniform system.
Yes, and those of us who study education, K-12 education, know that it's ridiculous. I mean, we want the opposite, and that kids need the opposite. Kids need different kinds of schools and different kinds of programs that fit their particular needs, developmental needs, and situations. And as one of the viewers mentioned earlier that a lot of parents choose private schools and religious schools just because of the safety element and, avoiding bullying and negative peer influences that they would get in the traditional public schools. Well, that's not uniformity then. If there's a much stronger moral and ethical and behavioral code in a particular school, you're violating uniformity. But some kids really need that, and parents are really the best decision makers for determining what their individual children need.
So I should address a couple of things in the comments here. Feel free to push back on me on anything that comes out of my mouth right now. So there has been a couple of comments about, well, one, going back to Michelle Johnson's point around really a lot of this research is based on bias samples of students, because the selectivity of students that opt into private schools or who can opt into neighborhoods or private schools that fit their needs creates its own bias. It's, if you look at that sample of people, so that feels methodological in its critique, like a critique around the methodology. I believe personally that the approaches to the studies have gotten more sophisticated to control for that. Tell me if I'm wrong. Is that right or wrong?
So every finding that I've mentioned is from a study that uses some method to control for selection into private schools and the selectivity of private schools. Some of the methods are more rigorous than others. Even if you limit yourself to the randomized controlled trials, which are close to the twin studies that you fantasized about, Chris, earlier.
I wouldn't say it's a fantasy. I have lots of fantasies. That's not one.
Well, you could also watch the movie Three Identical Strangers and see what the moral and ethical problems are with real twin studies, real separated at birth studies. But if you just limit it to the randomized controlled trials, which completely control for all characteristics of participants, both measurable and unmeasurable, you still get a pattern of results that suggest that the effects of private school choice programs on student outcomes tend to be neutral to positive in all of these areas. Stronger in terms of the character outcomes of students than the academic outcomes of students. In terms of the academic, it's more mixed when you look at just the gold standard studies. But you can't dismiss all of these findings based on a claim of selection bias, because many of these studies have completely eliminated selection bias through their rigorous methodology.
So another claim that is pretty consistent throughout my my comments here, the commenters, including Toya, who actually has shared this story before in during these shows around school choice, is that it doesn't work for everybody. It's like Toya's a parent who chose Catholic schools, spent quite a bit of money on inner city Catholic schools, only to have them require remediation. And I think this gets down to the question, does it work or is it better? The studies that get talked about a lot are like the Louisiana study. I believe so. Louisiana and DC. It seems to me there's a third study around the effectiveness, the academic effectiveness of offering school choice. I don't know what the third one is.
So I've conducted 3 studies in the last 12 years, 3 longitudinal evaluations of different private school choice programs: the DC program, the Milwaukee program, and the Louisiana program. And the results were different across those. The academic effects of the Louisiana program were negative, clearly negative, and strongly negative in math. So
just to be clear, that means that if you went into that program, the voucher program of Louisiana, you did worse.
That's right. In terms of test scores, no effect on college going. We looked at rates of going to college. So the students scored lower if they participated in the program. They scored lower on tests, but they enrolled in college at the same rate as the control group. And that was a randomized controlled trial. So that was a highly rigorous study. In contrast, in the Milwaukee program we evaluated, we saw some positive effects of that program on student reading test scores, and we saw clear positive effects of the Milwaukee program on student graduation from high school, enrollment in college, and even completion of a bachelor's degree. The rates were higher for the school choice kids. In DC, the results kind of fell in the middle. There was no conclusive evidence of any achievement effects of the program, positive or negative, but we did see students graduate from high school at much higher rates if they participated in the program. So I was the same researcher on all three of these.
Mhm.
And, there's variation in the findings because, like you said, I mean, I chase the evidence wherever it goes. I don't force it into any sort of preconceived outcome. And different programs are going to produce different results and are going to have different effects on different kids. And we haven't found any policy ever created that has a consistent positive effect on everybody. So, when we evaluate policies, we tend to look at averages. On average,
Mhm.
is it better than the alternative? And those are the kinds of evaluations we make.
Corey DeAngelis talks about the Louisiana study. Should families lose their vouchers based upon test score results? This is a critical question. I had Corey on and I talked to Corey about this. I've talked to Lindsay Burke about this. I think several of my conservative friends or more conservative friends that are school choice all-stars. I'm giving you guys a hard time about this. Are test scores really as important? And the reason I'm giving you guys a hard time, number one, because I can, and I know you guys and I like you. But this is what it seems like to me. It seems to me like school choice was sold for many years, not just as a way to get urban kids and kids of color out of really bad education deserts and pension farms instead of schools and into real schools where they could learn and do better and maybe even encounter Jesus at some point. We made that argument for years that it would result in a closing either of the achievement gap, definitely in better academics. And we would show schools, private schools and schools like Cristo Rey and others, where it would just be clear that, like, the kids in Catholic school, for instance, where I grew up in New Orleans, were doing better than the kids in district schools. But at some point, some folks, even you yourself included, started doing studies where saying, well, the real benefit isn't test scores. Test scores aren't really like necessarily that's not just a slam dunk with the test scores. So maybe we should look at some other stuff, right? Like, kids who go to the school choice program have better toenails. Why don't we do that? Now, I'm making fun of it, but I'm just because I do think some of the better things that happen for you are important. Less pregnancy, less crime, better credit, in life and in later life, better jobs, outcomes, better networks. All the things that people who are in integration say. Integrationists say that if you go to these schools where you have better networks, you do better in life because of it. Mm-hmm. So cool. It's not, I don't want to discount it. But the test score thing, isn't that still kind of important in some ways, shape, or form?
Sure. And first, let me say that my very first private school choice study was a study of its effect on civic outcomes. So I started this business looking at non-test score outcomes, mm-hmm. and then whenever possible, tried to examine multiple outcomes, because we expect education to do a lot of things. We do expect schools to teach kids, how to read and write and calculate and have knowledge of history and all those kinds of things. I mean, we do expect them to promote learning. Certainly, but we also expect them to develop character and responsible habits and things like that. So I'm one of those not either or. I'm and both kind of attitude, and I've always been that way. If you look at all of my studies, I try to look at multiple outcomes. Now, so I wouldn't discount the fact that test scores are important, and the record in support of private school choice programs would be stronger if the test score outcomes were more consistently positive. They aren't as consistently positive now as they were initially, and we don't know exactly why. It could be because the newer programs are more heavily regulated, and as a result, a lot of private schools, you spoke, Chris, about the autonomy that private schools value. If they see a set of government regulations that threaten that autonomy, they're going to say, we're not going to participate in this program, and that's going to take some very attractive choices off the table. It might be because of scale. The newer evaluations that have found some negative effects are looking at programs that are statewide and have larger numbers, and maybe the typical private school is just not significantly better than the typical public school in these areas outside of urban areas where the initial programs were launched. That could be part of the story too. We just don't know. But I think the bottom line, Chris, is if you sat down with a parent and you said, okay, we've got this program, and if you enroll your child in this private school choice program, the chances are their math test scores are going to suffer somewhat, but they're going to be more likely to graduate from high school, go to college, stay out of prison, and not create a child out of wedlock. Okay, you basically told a parent, that's the deal. Would you take that deal? I think most parents would take that deal. They'd sacrifice the test scores for these non-test score outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's what makes choice so important, though. I always say this, regardless of whether I agree with you or not on a point like that. The good thing about school choice is we don't have to agree or disagree. Like if you want a school that really focuses and doubles down on math and reading and having kids do well on test scores, then there should be a school for you. And
sure, and Colleen Dipple made that point during the show, is that you have a bunch of public charter schools that are academic press schools, which means they focus on test score achievement. They really do. Just throughout the day, they are focused on learning, teaching, learning, and not these non-cognitive character development outcomes. And you get what you choose for with those. They have a very strong record of producing higher test scores. So if test scores are what you want, there are schools that can deliver that, maybe more in the charter sector than in the private sector. If you want a school that tries to advance, and develop the whole child in all their capacities, then private schools tend to focus on that more than many of the charter schools do.
Yeah, I noticed in our comments, there's a lot of talk often about the selectivity of the schools when it comes to school choice. When we talk about school choice, and specifically when we talk about private schools and private schooling, I don't think that there's enough talk about the number of school choice programs nationally that are specifically aimed at the kids that districts don't want to educate oftentimes. Kids that are hard of hearing, kids that have dyslexia, kids that have some sort of very specific disability that requires them to seek education outside of the system. We don't talk enough about how many times the system is actually outsourcing the care of those kids and outsourcing, the obligation to educate those kids. And if you look at the number of school choice programs across all the states that have them, what you're going to see is at least a plurality, I would argue probably a majority of school choice programs that are specifically aimed at one hard to educate or one group of kids that are marginalized by the regular system or another. Kids who are in low income schools, kids who are low income themselves but need more gifted education, kids with very specific disabilities or twice exceptional characterizations, and that's who it's really for in a lot of cases. And also, I don't think people talk enough about who has been, when you talk about private schools, let's just be real, the majority of private schools are parochial schools, right? Yeah, I don't know if that's still true, but that has been true for years. So
it's right. Pretty much, they're down to like 50% Catholic.
Yeah, but it has been historically that has been the majority. And keep gut checking me, Patrick. And throughout that time, the majority of the population of those schools were low income. Urban Catholic schools serving many kids of color and many low-income kids either matched or exceeded the number of kids that didn't fit those designations.
That's definitely true, Chris. I mean, if your child doesn't have some clear disadvantage, it's extremely difficult to qualify for a private school choice program anywhere in the country. Almost, the only program in the country that isn't targeted to kids based either on being low income, having a disability, or being in a public school judged as failing. The only program that isn't limited to people in one of those three categories is the Cleveland Scholarship Program, and that's limited to students in Cleveland. And they basically kind of said, it's almost like, the community services designation for free and reduced lunch kids. They basically said, so many of our kids here in Cleveland meet the qualification anyway. We're just going to say, if you live in Cleveland, you get private school choice.
I was about to say, geographically limiting it to Cleveland is the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah. I wanted to avoid
Yeah.
I have friends who have Cleveland roots, so I didn't want to go there. But
statistically speaking,
Yeah, on the point about kids with disabilities. So I was at Georgetown University in 2004 when the Zellman v. Simmons-Harris ruling was handed down, ruling that private school choice programs don't violate the federal Constitution. So I went down to the Supreme Court for the release of that. I couldn't get in to actually see the release, but I was on the Supreme Court steps. And the president of the American Civil Liberties Union gave a very impassioned speech when the verdict was announced that school choice is constitutional. And he declared, private schools do not enroll students with disabilities. He said it absolutely unqualified. No private school anywhere ever in history has enrolled a child with a disability. And he made that claim, and the crowd cheered and everything. I'm like, that is so false. If you look at the total enrollment, 500,000 students enrolled in private school choice programs across the country last year. 25% of those students were in programs that are limited to students with disabilities. That's double the rate of students with disabilities in traditional public schools.
Wow.
So, that statement could not have been more false. And it does underlie your point that it's almost, private school choice programs are almost like, the Statue of Liberty plaque. It's give us your poor, you're tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free. It's like that. We will welcome kids who have certain disadvantages and are struggling in certain ways. We will welcome them in to private schools of choice to see if those work better for them.
So as we wrap, I think there are just two things I wanted to give you as an example. Maybe you can respond to them and tell me what's your takeaway, and I can predict a little bit of it, and then I'll end with just pointing to something that I wrote that deals with the religious part of what we're talking about right now. But the first thing, just to put before you, is Randy Weingarten, the nation's leading expert on public school teacher theology, I guess. She's the leader of the Church of the Unionized Teacher and the Great Sisters of Pensionistas. And this is what she writes in response to the case. The ruling in the Espinosa case is a seismic shock that threatens both public education and religious liberty. And then she made a full statement about it. That second part about it being an issue about religious liberty also, I want to save for a second here and just go to the first part. Pat Wolf, is it a seismic shock that threatens public education that Espinosa won in this case?
It's really difficult to respond to that. She almost creates an idea that traditional public schools are fragile, are these tremendously fragile institutions. And if you allow some people to choose other options, they will collapse like a house of cards. It's almost like she doesn't have confidence in her own organization to deliver a service that enough parents will value that they will keep their child receiving this free service as opposed to switching to another one. And with many of these private school choice programs, like the Montana program, the family still has to pay some money. It isn't totally free to them like the traditional public schools are. So Ms. Weingarten is basically saying that the free service that traditional public schools provide is so fragile that if you give parents a discount on the private schooling alternative, no one will choose our organization. Well, that's almost a vote of confidence, a vote of no confidence in your own program and your own approach. So I'm not really convinced by that. And of course, we haven't seen that. Basically, when a private school choice program is launched, usually, initially the first few years, 5 to 10% of the eligible student population signs up and participates, and it's usually the kids who are just really struggling in the traditional public schools. They're the ones most desperate for an alternative. As these programs, if they demonstrate success, then they build and enrollment grows. If they don't, like in the case of the Louisiana Scholarship Program, enrollment is actually down in that program since our research has established that it's having a negative effect on student test scores. So
program, so people are not necessarily investing in it as much.
Yeah.
To your bigger point here, I think everybody should pay attention to the fact that the leader of the teaching profession in the United States is telling you point blank that if given the choice, too many Americans would choose not the schools that her members oversee. And that's really critical to her point. Her point isn't that we're having some sort of values war or values battle, or that it's not right for families to have access to these other schools. It's just she is arguing that there is a need to trap families who disagree with the pension farms that they call schools and the starter prisons that they call schools. You're not saying that, Pat Wolf. I just want to make sure for everybody else, Chris Stewart is saying that, Pat Wolf's not saying that. But the bottom line is that is the essence of your argument and hers that I think is right, which is she is saying that if you give people an opportunity and a choice, like the Espinosa family, too many of them will find fault with the school districts, regular school district schools, and want to go somewhere else. So the strategy should be to prevent them from having that option, which is, I can't think of anything more un-American. So anyways, the last point I want to switch to, she also said that this is an attack on religious liberty. And I know what they're doing there. Teachers unions now are actually supporting and funding religious front groups to make some sort of weird, clever argument that voucher programs are actually an attack on religious liberty. They're an attack on religious freedom. So here's Pastors for Children, which is an organization that is now going into multiple different states. And their tweet about it, the Supreme Court decision today devalues both private and public education. Private religious schools were formed to be religiously neutral. Public school dollars shouldn't be diverted to them. I've had interaction with them before where I've asked them the theological basis for their opposition. Their belief is that God believes in the common good, and the public schools are about the common good, and we should not pull out of that because we'll do damage to poor kids and others. That's one. But the other one is the pastor who runs this organization has basically said, I'm a Baptist pastor. I wouldn't want the government favoring Catholic pastors or any other. We should be free to make sure that none of us gets the advantage through government, for one. I don't know how that works. And then two, it's the camel's nose in the tent idea that if you start going down this path, government will infect religious schools and religious institutions, and they'll start becoming quasi secular.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's highly speculative, right? And courts and legislators could stop that from happening at any point. If the fact that some government resources were going directly or indirectly to religious schools to support, the public good of educating children, if that led to the state mandating certain theological principles or banning religious education or anything, we could stop. Someone would stop the process right there. So the fact that hypothetically something really bad for religion could happen as a result of this is an unconvincing argument. Then stop whatever would be bad. But another thing to remember is that public schools in the United States were Protestant, were Protestant religious schools for the first 110 plus years of their operation. They mandated the reading of the King James Bible. They had religion classes, and they were basically we've had government schools that were religious. In the 1950s, a series of court cases ruled that that's unconstitutional. That's because the traditional public schools are the main ones available to kids. They can't be religious. But there really hasn't been the one court case where a state tried to say no schools in our state could be religious. That was the state of Oregon, 1922. Reconnecting with your Blaine Amendment story, Chris, it was an initiative promoted by the Ku Klux Klan to outlaw private schooling in the state of Oregon. In a unanimous ruling, a 9-0 ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1925 called Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the court ruled the child is not the mere creature of the state, so private schooling and religious schooling has to be available to families. And I just don't see how making it available to some families so that their child has this sort of continuous and consistent values instruction in school and at home and in church, synagogue, or mosque, that somehow threatens religion or diminishes or endangers religion. I think it's much easier and more convincing to argue that it allows religion to thrive.
Let's quickly hit on this point too, because I don't think we hit it hard enough, and I don't think I hit it at all, really. The Blaine Amendment is something that people should look up if they really want to think about this case more deeply. We've talked about the racist history of school choice when we talk with unions. That's what they say. They say that school choice has a very racist history. They talk about, the schools in Mississippi that closed and segregation academies, all of that. They try to give that as the narrative and the genesis of school choice, which we can argue about in a different show. But the Blaine Amendments is kind of a counter argument in the racist history of opposing school choice. And definitely opposing Catholic schools and Catholic schooling. And you just mentioned, I don't think people know, in the state of Oregon, Oregon, the attempt to outlaw, not the attempt, actually was successful, right? They outlawed.
They did, and then it was challenged and overturned. Yeah,
and overturned. But the Blaine Amendment is something people should look up, because it's these amendments that come from that point of view are in 37 states, and in those states, this is the basis for fighting school choice often. And there's a very racist, nativist, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic basis to those amendments, which are still active. Now, you go ahead and tell me your thought about it, because you push back a little bit on how important it is to make a big deal that this new case overturned that some kind of way.
I mean, the Blaine Amendment, James G. Blaine was a bigoted, racist, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, just bad guy. and a very powerful man in the 1870s. He was Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1875, and he ran for president as the head of the Republican ticket. So Blaine was in his argument, and the Blaine Amendment, the key to the Blaine Amendments is the language sectarian, because at that time, Protestantism was just considered to be the religion of the nation. It wasn't a formally established religion, but in practice, the majority of Americans were Protestant, and the public schools were Protestant. So the Blaine Amendments prohibited government support of sectarian schools and organizations. And sectarian was understood to be Catholic at that time, because a lot of Irish and German and Italians had immigrated to the United States as the land of opportunity. And a lot of people at the time, really bigoted people at the time, felt that threatened the Protestant majority in the United States. And so they wanted to limit the success of Catholic organizations and institutions, including Catholic schools. So that's the genesis of these Blaine Amendments. Blaine tried to get his amendment established as in the federal Constitution. That failed by a single vote in the Senate. I mean, it was a very near thing. And then he demanded that every new state admitted to the Union have a Blaine Amendment, or it wouldn't be admitted. That's why you see in that graphic, so many of the states west of the Mississippi River are color coded because they have Blaine Amendments. Only the white ones don't have Blaine Amendments. And basically, the idea was, okay, if we can't stop this at the federal level, we'll stop it at the state level. And then it became a case of, how strong is your Blaine? How is it interpreted by the judiciary? I know both of our home state of Minnesota is there in green. And what's interesting about Minnesota is its judiciary has interpreted its Blaine Amendment not to be very strict, not to prohibit very much. And that's really what the Espinoza case is saying. The Espinoza case did not rule that Blaine Amendments are unconstitutional. It ruled that they cannot be applied in a way that prohibits people from choosing religious schools if a state has a private school choice program. So it sort of severely weakened the reach and effect of Blaine Amendments, but it didn't ban them completely. But they were birthed in hate. They really, and the whole point was to take away discretion from lawmakers to enact programs that deliver social services and public services through faith-based organizations, and to sort of take that option off the table for legislators. Well, it seems pointless at this point. Why can't we let the people's representatives decide if they want social services delivered through faith-based organizations, which oftentimes are very effective in doing so, and people themselves like to receive services from faith-based organizations. So let's put that on the table and leave that as an option, and put the sad history of bigotry that's captured in Blaine Amendments in our rearview mirror.
Well, I mean, I think there's no more important reason to do it than to say to people who have the anti-school choice narrative that school choice is rooted in discrimination and in segregation and segregation academies and in racism, to have to answer for the fact that the thing that they are standing on most right now is exactly what they're saying, about us, which is, it is rooted in nativist behavior, in anti-Catholic, anti-religious, and the KKK was instrumental in the Blaine stuff. So it's very much a KKK thing. So for a teachers union in modern times to be standing on something that directly has its lineage in the KKK as an intellectual thought product for why they should argue against school choice today is not called out enough. People should know this. They should talk about it more. All right. So we are at time and wrap. I want to say earlier, because I hate to say I'm going to do something and they don't do it, I'm quickly going to just show, we had a point about the religious frame of this discussion, wherever I wrote something years ago that I just wanted to share with people. If you just Google, you can find, just Google Citizen Stewart and Napoleon Hill. This will probably come up. And it was a thing that I had written on Napoleon Hill, who was an author from the early 1900s. A pastor actually shared this with me after an education discussion. He stopped me after dinner one night and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of Napoleon Hill and the book Outwitting the Devil?" I kind of lied, I think, because it sounded familiar, but it's like, yeah, I kind of like, I don't know about Outwitting the Devil, but Napoleon Hill sounds familiar. And it was because I knew some of his other writings. But Outwitting the Devil is this really weird book where he basically puts the devil on trial, and he interrogates the devil through the book. The devil's literally in a courtroom on trial, and he's interrogating him. And there's a public school section of the interrogation where the devil basically admits how he sees public schools and teachers as fitting into a grand plan, right? And it's so important for today. If you go and read this book wasn't published until long after Napoleon Hill died, because they felt it was way too provocative and powerful for the times. But in terms of the frame that we have around religiosity and education and whatnot, I'd say to people, please go check this out. I don't have time to do it justice right now, but go check it out, because it's a really interesting dialogue about the standardization, industrialization, bureaucratization of education, and how that all favors creating a certain type of person and citizen that drifts from their purpose and doesn't think very critically. And that's what is not good for society. That's what he's trying to get at in this book, is that the anti-religious, anti-God theology of the secular church that becomes public schools is not great for the common good. So please go check it out. Go read it. That's not the point of today's thing, but I said I'd come back to that, so I did. Patrick, thank you so much for your time today, for your great expertise. I have your Twitter handle going by on the bottom if people want to reach you. Is there any other thing that you want to point people to? Do you have any new studies, any new papers out?
The last thing I'd like to do is do a shout out to my mom, Sally. She's a lot like Ms. Espinoza. She was a single mom who sacrificed tremendously for her children to get an effective education. And today she celebrates her 82nd birthday. So Chris, she's your neighbor. So if you hear a wild party going on tonight, it's Sally celebrating 82 years.
Did you say 82? Wow, that's great. And she is really close by to me here. Well, congratulations, Sally. Happy birthday. And congratulations on producing a semi-loyal son who likes to claim Minnesota at times and claims to be a Viking fan, but likes to do it from the South. Interesting enough. Appreciate that. Patrick, it's always a joy, always an honor. Hopefully you'll come back. We'll continue these conversations.
Happy to come back anytime, Chris, and hopefully we'll win our election in November.
Yes, everybody vote for Stuart Wolf, the Stuart Wolf ticket. We'll get you a hat there. Thank you guys as always for listening, watching, coming in, making this day important and special. This conversation each day I'm learning from. Glad that you guys offer so much in the comments that help us have a great discussion. So Patrick, audience members, everybody else, make the most of today. Let's have a great one.